Okay, so this is like a tiny end-to-end implementation of our tag display, like main architectural blocks, maybe a controller, maybe some hard-coded in-memory repository. Half-baked implementation, very, very poor UI. No muscles yet, it's just a skeleton after all, but it can walk. So how can we get this skeleton into some shared pre-production environment without showing this into production? Well, we need to ask Beyoncé. If you liked it, then you should put a flag on it. By the way, sorry Google for stealing your testing line. And Conduit, the company we're talking about here, is an early stage startup. So they use some platform as a service because they cannot afford to get PhD in Kubernetes yet. So it means that by definition, they have to follow 12-factor approach. So all the configuration that they have is inside the environment variables. So what can we do? We can use environment variables as our flags. We can turn the flag on for everyone in development, but we need to turn it off in production. Okay, that's simple. Charles writes this tiny piece of code to read the environment variable as high up the stack as possible. So this is essentially some backend route in Express wrapped inside the if check. And I'm not sure if we have any JavaScript developers here. Do we have any JavaScript developers here? Okay, so probably your blood is boiling now because you're seeing double equals, right? And you're probably feeling this urge to correct me. But that's not the problem that is actually found in code review, because the reviewer actually points to the environment variables spreading all over our code base. And the reviewer suggests this code instead. Charles looks at this and he instantly assumes the reviewer knows more about programming than Charles, because the reviewer is using something different than Visual Studio Code. And he actually pays for his IDE like 20 euro per month, which makes him even more credible. But also, he likes this new abstraction of a toggles client, because we can actually hide where we read this flag from. So he accepts this suggestion, but then Charles writes this code in the front-end React code. He's reading the flag that was passed from the backend, and he reads it in his front-end code. So this React, because React won, just the same way our parents didn't get fired for choosing IBM, we don't get fired for choosing React, right? It's a safe bet nowadays. So here comes the next requirement. We need to release our dancing skeleton this time to our internal users in production. So the question is, what's the difference between walking skeleton and dancing skeleton? You can only dance in production with real logging, real users, and real monitoring. So very often we have our skeleton dancing in staging, and it's beautiful. But then you put it into production, and the hand falls off, right? So in theory, staging and production are the same, but in practice they're not. Does anyone know who said this? It was Albert Einstein. Maybe. So even if your ops people are telling you production and staging are the same, I wouldn't trust. So let's make our skeleton dancing in production, but only for our development team. And as always, Countess Loveless to the rescue. You will need a dynamic release toggle with the user ID activation strategy. So let's unpack this. She talks about release toggles. Probably there are different toggle types, not just release toggles. She talks about dynamic toggles. So these, unlike the static environment variables we've seen before. And she also talks about activation strategies. So let's unpack those words. Let's start with the release toggle. This is the definition I'm going to show from the Feature Toggles article from Martin Fowler's Bleaky, written by Pete Hodgson. And here is what it says. Release toggles allow incomplete and untested code paths to be shipped to production as latent hidden code, which may never be turned on. So really, using those release toggles shifts the bar from it has to work perfectly before I put it into production to it doesn't break production. Woo, pressure off. Now, the activation strategy. What's the activation strategy? This is, by the way, the domain vocabulary we use at Unleash. Activation strategy specifies which users we enable our feature for. So we want to say, in production, we're going to enable this feature for our 2-pizza team. So those are the 5 user IDs on our team. But in development, we're going to have a standard activation strategy that's very similar to the environment variables we saw before. So one of them is like a scalpel. This is like those 5 users. The other one is like a chainsaw, either on or off. Now, at this point, Charles is very, very eager to build this custom feature toggling solution himself, because it seems like a really, really fun distraction from daily work. And Charles, like most developers here probably, we prefer to build everything except from the monolith that we are paid to maintain, right? So, Charles starts with the mother of all software architectures, the square barrel pattern. So, we're gonna have a toggle API talking to a toggle database. So let's choose boring Postgres here. Then we're gonna have another square here, the admin UI to configure the toggles. This is gonna be boring React, but it's only half the square size because the backend architecture is more important. And finally, we're gonna have tiny SDK that we can embed in our monolithic server-side application. And this tiny SDK will be fetching the toggles over boring HTTP protocol. Okay, so boring Postgres, boring React, boring HTTP. Boring is good. Boring makes you money. Boring doesn't wake you up at night. In the meantime, the feature is ready. The skeleton got some muscles, it's alive, it's kicking. It's time to show it to real users, precisely to 1% of them. And 1% sounds like a new activation strategy that we're gonna call a gradual rollout. And the important part is, when we say 1% of users, it should be consistent 1% of users. So now our activation strategy is the ever-growing list of internal user IDs, because maybe we grabbed 2 people from the Silicon Valley layoffs, so we have more internal users, but also 1% of the general user base, with this stickiness built in, so you are consistently 1%. Let's stop for a second and let's think what we have achieved so far. Because we managed to decouple deployment from release. So what's a deployment? Deployment is a technical event that's focused on getting the code from your machine to production in a continuous manner. Something that was very, very uncommon in the 19th century, but also something that's very, very uncommon in the 21st century. But this one is supposed to be boring. Let me ask you a question. Who's clapping on a Ryanair flight when you're landing? Who is clapping? Be honest. You are probably the same people who are clapping after a successful code deployment. But here's my advice. No clapping. Those are supposed to be boring routine events. No clapping. On the other hand, release. Ooh, that's a different story. Because this is an exciting business event. Because now we're showing new capabilities to the world. And you can select who's gonna see the new capability. So let's celebrate, let's drink some champagne, but not too much because there's another day and another requirement. Product manager is very eager to release this new feature that we built, but this time to the entire user base. And she's like, we need to move fast. But Sam, our new head of operations at Conduit, he wants to keep an eye on performance. So he's like, okay, move fast, but please do not break things. And Sam recently left a Ruby shop. Our new head of operations left a Ruby shop, and he tells this story. DevOps don't know. Prod is getting hot. At the Ruby shop, doing something unholy. So, Conduit is not a Ruby shop, but the performance implications of the new SQL query that we're introducing are unknown at a bigger scale. So we want to have an option to turn this feature off just in case our new feature, or the SQL query, starts doing something unholy. So let's change our toggle type from the release toggle to the operational toggle to communicate the purpose of our new feature toggle. And the difference is mostly in semantics. Release toggles, releasing new feature, operational toggles, controlling operational characteristics. And usually those release toggles live much longer. Operational toggles usually live for a few days. And let's release this to the world. And it was a huge success. Developers are sold on feature toggles. Ops are sold on feature toggles. They are dancing their happy DevOps dance. But now, the marketing dude He wants to join the party. He's like, ooh, big dollar, huge dollar, big potential. I want to use those toggles and measure which of those two variants generates more clicks. Is it popular tags or is it trending tags? And I want to test it in production. So we need a different toggle that we're gonna call experiment toggle. And let's call this one article tags title. And by the way, please do not recycle previous toggles. Okay, we need to create a new one because otherwise those things happen. Please do not turn off the light switch. So that's a toggle in the lighting subdomain. It also operates the elevator. So that's the transportation subdomain. That's some really, really surprising coupling that I wouldn't expect. So let's go back to our experiment. So we want to run this experiment on 100% of our users. We don't want to exclude anyone. But now we also need a variant. Okay, a variant that tells us, okay, 50% of our users will see popular tags and 50% will see trending tags. Okay, so we're making this 50-50 split. But now the marketing folks, they can control the text that will be displayed on the page. And they should be able to inject like CSV and JSON, so it almost feels like programming to them. But in order to make it feel like magic or almost like programming, our toggle SDK needs to support those variants. So it's no longer enabled, disabled, but now we're actually showing different variants. But there's actually one more thing that will make our SDK client really, really joyful to use. It has to follow Unix philosophy. So it has to do one thing well. So your feature toggling solution, surprise, surprise, should be really good at feature toggling, but also it should play well with others. And it shouldn't pretend that it can be great at everything. So it should be easy to integrate, for example, with whatever existing analytics platform you have. So maybe it should emit the event every time something interesting happens in the toggling domain. And probably your company already has an opinion which spying, analytics solution you want to have. And possibly, this is probably more than one, and you don't want your feature toggling solution to be another spy on this list. All right, let's talk about a different capability in our system, because our blogging platform supports this comment system that was built a long time ago by a developer called Michael. And this part of our application is not very stable. When too many people start commenting, the whole system goes down. So just to give you backstory, this is Michael. This is a senior developer who built this feature. And CI server was constantly failing for him, so he just disabled everything. So he was like, oh, the TypeScript is failing, let's disable the types. And he turned TypeScript into suggestion script. Oh, linter, it can't tell me what code I write. So now the code base looks like this is Sparta meets functional programming wonderland. So now you have while loops and for loops that would make your grandparents really, really proud. But then you find a flat map that Michael didn't really understand. So he copied code from Stack Overflow. But unfortunately, he didn't copy the code from the most voted answer. He didn't even copy the code from the least voted answer. He copied the code from the question itself. And then he left. But before he left, his manager asked, hey, can you document your shenanigans? Can you write some ADR? And he was like, no, I'm just going to write a comment. This is not a bug. It's just the way we do things. So this code, in summary, doesn't bring much confidence. And we need a way to disable it. Okay, before we fix our code, we need a way to disable the comments to mitigate potential incidents. And it sounds like a job for a toggle, a very specialized toggle that we know as a kill switch. So, disable comments kill switch. It's almost the same as operational, but usually the kill switch toggle lives much longer. And you can think of a kill switch as the inverted feature flag. So most of the time it's off. When you turn it on, you kill the feature. And very often, our ops people, they want to use this kill switch not just manually, but they want to integrate it with the monitoring infrastructure and with some scripts. And this is not a trivial problem to solve. So they will need some instructions. They need to know, how do I integrate with this API for feature toggles? How do I access this API with some access tokens? So they will need some manual to read. But if you want them to read the manual, well, then you have to make a better manual for them. and cannot be something that you always postpone into Q4. Why am I saying this? Because it looks like our simple feature toggling solution that we are planning to build in-house is getting more and more complicated, both at the code level, but also around the code, as you have to document it because it becomes part of the platform that other teams can work on. And this is the first time Charles thinks to himself, we do those things not because they are easy, but because we thought they were going to be easy. And then he hides. So let's summarize this part, because we've seen the most common toggle types. We've seen release toggles for releasing new features. We've seen ops toggles for reducing deployment risk. We've seen experiment toggles for A/B testing. And we've seen kill switch toggles for mitigating incidents. But to be honest, there's many, many more jobs that you can hire your feature toggles for. By the way, how many people are familiar with jobs to be done theory? Who has heard this term before? Jobs to be done theory. Okay, one person. Okay, so people basically hire your product to do different jobs. So this lady here, she's hiring this frying pan for some experimentation purposes. But the other lady in the background, she's hiring this frying pan as a kill switch, okay, to pacify her partner who didn't buy her tickets for this lovely conference here. Okay, so jokes aside, let's talk about feature toggles at scale, the last part today. So as companies adopt feature toggles, they create more and more of them. And very often toggles become the victim of their own success. And this is what happened at Conduit. The team has to type the same 5 user IDs over and over again. So it means there's a missing abstraction. And most feature toggle solutions platforms also have a concept of a segment to avoid this problem. So let's create a segment called Conduit Dev Team. This is our development team. And we're going to say, those are the constraints that make up the segment. So whoever is this user in this list working on the application called Conduit, this is our segment. So the next time someone joins or leaves your company, you don't have to update all your feature toggles because you just edit the segment. So it's much more maintainable. And there's one super important part here in this architecture, is that the information about your user ID, about your email, the application that you work on, should never leave this place. It should never leave your toggle SDK. Why is that? Why shouldn't we send this data to the Toggle API? Why should we only get the initial config from the Toggle API and evaluate everything locally? There are 2 reasons. First, for performance. Okay, you want to evaluate whether a feature is on or off for a given person instantly, but also for data privacy reasons. And I see some of you, you don't mind, for example, sharing your heartbeat with Apple or Google, right? You're wearing those smartwatches. But personally, I'll be very, very concerned, for example, if a banking application was sharing my user data with some Toggle API. Okay, let's talk about the next problem. Some of the users start complaining because they are getting this weird error, password is too common. What does it mean too common, they ask? It turns out that the development team was working on this new experimental password hints feature, but someone accidentally turned this feature on. So obviously we have feature toggles, we can disable it instantly, but now we can do a post-mortem. We can check, oh, what's the impact of this? How many people have seen it? Ooh, it's only 3%, it's not bad. But then we can actually go to the actual crime scene, to go through the event log and see who did what and when. And check this out, this was Alex, this was our sales guy who was so eager to demo this new feature to a customer that he actually turned it on during a customer call. But he also enabled this feature for everyone else. Now, Alex from the sales team feels really sorry for his mistake. But you know what? It's the second time it has happened this week. So we need to do something with Alex. Should we punish him? No, not really, because we can solve this problem with an API. We need an API for this. We need to assume positive intent. Okay, it's not his fault. Okay, it's a systemic problem. Why did our system of work allow for this type of mistake? And what can we do in future to prevent people from different parts of the organization from flipping each other's feature toggles? So, let's organize our toggles into projects, let's assign people to those projects, and let's give them appropriate permissions. So Alex, for example, will be part of the sales team, but not part of the development team. And one of the biggest lessons I've learned is that your feature toggle organization will be only as good as your organization. So it's another manifestation of the Conway's law. So just to give you an example, if you have some post-technical VP of engineering detached from code by like 20 years, who's happily drawing your organizational structure in PowerPoint, probably your feature toggle organization will be as bad as your organization. On the other hand, if you have some very technical VP of engineering who understands bounded context, who understands team topologies, and designs a nice organization, probably also your toggle organization would be very, very nice. Okay, let's talk about the last challenge of today. Because Conduit got 100 toggles in their system. And at this point, Charles is like, oh, toggles suck. We have too many of them. I'm going back to long-lived feature branches. I was right. Toggles suck. Well, it's your usage of feature toggles that sucks, Charles, because long-lived feature branches are a problem. But so are long-lived feature toggles. Most of them should not live forever. So our recommendation at Unleash is that your operational toggles, they should last up for maybe a week, maybe a few days. The release toggles and experiment toggles, probably a few weeks, just to give you enough time to finish the feature or to run the experiment and get enough data. And the only exception to this rule is kill switch toggles. Those are probably the only toggles that I would keep forever or for a long time, but I would put them into a separate project. And now, your toggle platform should give you insight. Which of your toggles are getting expired? Which of your toggles are getting stale? And what's like the overall health of your toggle ecosystem? And remember that removing one stale feature toggle a day will keep the doctor away. Or I should say, will keep a vet away, because there's one thing that your dog and feature toggles have in common. And you should clean after them. Okay? Please clean after your toggles. And if you see your neighbor not cleaning after their toggles, please let them know. Or if your own toggle is getting stale and nobody is watching, and it really stinks, you still need to pick it up. Okay? So, this new building system that we've been working on, this feature toggle hasn't been seen in production for like 3 weeks. It means someone already removed it from the code. We can probably remove it from our feature toggle management system and call it a day. And when people see those more advanced enterprise capabilities, they really start realizing the complexity of the problem. And there is value in building this stuff yourself. And I know that many companies can afford it. Like GitHub can afford it, LinkedIn can afford it, and I'm pretty sure that what they built in-house is a really fit for purpose for them and really joyful to use. But unfortunately, most of the feature toggle solutions that I've seen built in-house look like this. There's like a million unrelated switches. You have no clue what most of them are doing. Okay? And there's always this senior family member who holds this thing as the source of power, and he's like, this is mine, you can't touch it. So what can you do? Well, you learn to ignore most of this stuff. Okay? You create 10 simple feature toggles yourself, you give them meaningful names, and you just hope that you never click this red thing over here, because God knows what it's doing. So let's go back to the ultimate question. Should I build this stuff or should I buy it? This is the eternal question in software development. Fortunately, domain-driven design literature gives us some really, really nice tool for categorizing different parts of your domain. So we don't fall in this trap, oh, we need to build everything ourselves because we are so good at software, versus let's outsource everything because we are so bad at software. So core subdomain. This is where you actually make most of your money. This is where you want to put your most expensive people. And I really, really hope that's you. Okay, for Conduit, this is going to be articles. Then we have supporting subdomain. This is all the software that we build in-house, but that's not our differentiator. And you can put less expensive people, and hopefully that's not you. Hopefully that's your neighbor, right? And finally, we have this generic subdomain, which is all the open source, all the software as a service that we can grab off the shelf. And very often, companies start with their own feature toggling solution in the supporting subdomain. But then they realized, you know what? Not a single customer gave us 5 stars on, I don't know, some app store because of the custom feature toggling solution that we built. So let's outsource this part. This is where we don't want to spend our time. But other times, people decide, I want to build like a best-in-class solution for something that everyone else needs. I'm going to turn it into open source project. Maybe I'm going to make a business out of it, or just do both. And this is what happened to my colleague Ivar from Norway, who started Unleash like 10 years ago as a side project at work. And over time, it became like very, very popular. This is open source with like 18 million Docker downloads. There's SDKs for all major languages, and the GitHub stars are pouring. And now other companies like GitHub, if you go to GitLab and use their feature toggle solution, this is actually built on top of Unleash, so other companies can start building on top. So the cool part of doing open source, it's no longer buy versus build, because you can buy in quotation marks, you can take it if it's open source, and add this one missing feature that you need yourself on top of it. And you don't need to wait for, oh, it's on our roadmaps, gonna be done in Q4. Because you can always add this one missing feature yourself. So let's summarize. What have we learned today? First and foremost, decouple boring from exciting. Okay, deployment, boring, release, exciting. Explore different jobs that you can hire your feature toggles for. And we only really scratched the surface here. Clean after your toggles, just the same way you'd clean after your dog. And finally, be aware of the cost of building this stuff yourself. So that's basically the end of my story about feature development, software development with flags. Beyoncé-Driven Development, BDD. I'm pretty sure this acronym is taken, right? There's not much acronym real estate in software development, so let's call it Feature Flag Driven Development, FFDD. Oh, by the way, before we go, let's check what's up with Charles, because he's been promoted to a senior developer position. He still works in post-GitHub world. GitHub is here to stay, even though some tech bros mistook it for a hiring tool. But now he starts questioning branches and pull requests. Okay? For some types of work, he stopped doing pull requests. And finally, because he started using feature toggles, he can finally move fast without breaking things. And last week, he found this old school physical letter in his mailbox. And it reads like this. Dear Charles, you are finally as accurate and as much to be relied on as I am myself. Okay, thanks, bye. Ada. Thank you.